Hello and welcome to The Last Word on Spurs. We are your multi-award winning Tottenham Hotspur podcast. And yes, we're back again during this summer transfer window. Yes, it is open. Before I know there's that laughter track in the background. We've got a wonderful, wonderful special returning guest, The Last Word on Spurs, that we're delighted to have back alongside me. I always say he's only here for the big ones. Jamie Brown's back from the Daily Hotspur. Jay, how are you? Lovely to see you.
I'm good, Ricky. And obviously, as you said, we've got a fantastic guest tonight. Unfortunately, it's a little bit quiet at the moment at Spurs, but obviously we never know, especially the way Johan Langer works. Yes. Something out of nowhere. But yes. No, obviously, really excited for this show. And as you said, a really, really top guest tonight.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the thing with Tottenham is they're either at 100 miles per hour or we're stuck in kind of 15, 20 miles per hour. There's no real kind of give or take on the pendulum of Tottenham Hotspur. But it does feel a bit quiet out there. And this is why, again, shows like this works so well because it gives an intrigue as to what's happening. And one man I can definitely tell you knows a lot with what goes on around Tottenham, having covered them for many, many years. I'll let him tell you rather than me because I don't want to age him too much. We've got the wonderful Daily Telegraph football news correspondent, of course, has covered Tottenham for many, many years. The brilliant Matt Law returns. Matt, lovely to see you. How are you?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I was just... I was thinking about it. Martin Jol was definitely my first manager of covering Tottenham. I didn't do any Jacques Santini, so definitely 15 years or so. It's a long time. A lot of managers. I'd struggle to go chronologically through every single manager, and every time Daniel sacks another manager, I have to check how many managers it is again. But yeah, it's not a quiet club. Let's put it like that.
Absolutely not. 14 managers in the last 24 years that have seen that exit door. Welcome in Thomas Frank, and let's wish him all the very, very best. And as you'll know, Matt, from your start in tenureship at Tottenham, where they sacked the manager at half-time in Martin Jol, you should have always known, Matt, what was coming, right? What you were going to cover. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, it feels like seeing it all at Tottenham with the way managers have gone. You know, you got Conte, who sort of gave his famous exit speech and got on an EasyJet plane back to Italy and never came back. You had Pochettino, gets to a Champions League final. A few months later, he's sacked. Like you say, the Jol sacking. Wanda Ramos wins a trophy. He goes. Ange does something historic. He goes. It never feels like a sort of just a natural sacking, shall we say, or a normal thing. Nuno after about 10 games or whatever it was.
Yeah. It is a crazy football club. We're blessed to support it and then try and cover it here on Last Word on Spurs. And look, I've got to say, I think you'll know, Matt, certainly in the last 12, 18 months around the fan base, there's been a lot of split views, split opinions with regards to the manager of Ange Postecoglou and what Spurs should have done. I know there was a massive amount of people that would love to have seen Ange go into that third season. There was some that also felt a change was required. So it'll be fascinating to kind of get your take as well in terms of what you've made over the course of the last 12, 18 months, where I know for many out there, they've wavered like me as an emotive fan that I am and try and provide a balance on this show. It's been difficult at times. It's been really, really difficult. And I think what makes it even more difficult for some out there is that Tottenham have just released, if you're not aware, Tottenham have just released out there their winners video footage from the Europa League final, which again is, I'd implore you to go and watch that from the club. It was actually really well put together. I mean, there might be an argument that you could see some of the interviews that have been staged have maybe been done after we've won it. But again, it kind of reminds you of maybe angles and videos that you haven't seen because everyone was caught up in, for what many would have been, the best week of their lives. And, it does remind you just how crazy we had that week in which we won a trophy. But before we do get your thoughts on the departure of Ange and the incoming of Frank, I want to play out there for many what was Ange's speech that he gave to the players. And maybe, Matt, you can come in and tell us maybe why there was that period of 10 days or so while they were wavering. So let's bring that into the show and go from there. Let's hear from Ange.
Okay, from the day I arrived was about family. We're not in this position just because of our football. We're in this position because all of you, plus the staff, stuck together like family through the tough times. And we're going to need that today. Remember why we do this. It's not just about winning things. It's about paying back. giving to people who love us, who make sacrifices for us. So you walk out today, not just the 11 brothers, you walk out today with all of us with you, with all those people with you, the thousands in the stadium with you, hundreds of thousands back home with you. We're the biggest element, and they can't stop us. They can't stop us. What we have can't be stopped. Just go out there, play our football, be like a family, and at the end of the game, when he's lifting that trophy, when he's lifting that trophy, you're going to make all those people proud and they haven't ever been in their life.
It does feel like these last 12, 18 months has been some kind of a movie. I know some feel it's been a roller coaster of a movie with a very amazing ending to it. But I'll hand over to Joe to kickstart this last win on Spurs on the back of that. For some will follow an emotive video of Ange delivering that final speech to those players ahead of the Europa League final.
I mean, that's the first time I've seen that video. I was going to watch the whole documentary, but yeah, hearing that, I mean, that's just kind of why I love Ange Postecoglou. I mean, he's, you know, the togetherness that he kind of built in that team was amazing. But yeah, obviously he was sacked, and it has been a really odd season. Of course, we did deliver that trophy, and it was an amazing feeling. But of course, there was the league form. As we all know, the 22 record defeats, a 17th place finish. So obviously it's such a mixture of emotions this season, and that's why there is going to be such a split between people watching tonight who might maybe think that it was the right decision to get rid of him, who wanted to keep hold of him. But obviously, just to get your take on it, Matt, and maybe kind of the ins and outs of the whole situation regarding the sacking of Ange Postecoglou. Yeah, but just interested to get your take on whether you think it was the right decision or not.
I mean, if you're asking my opinion, I thought it's a scandalous decision. I thought it's, you know, as someone who has been around Tottenham for so many years and written so much about trophy droughts, about, you know, in quotation, Spursiness, about the narrative around the club, to see a guy gamble everything in a season and win, because he gambled everything. He put his, you know, if they'd have lost, nobody could have complained that he was going to be sacked, and it would have been an absolute car crash of a season, let's face it. But he picked up very early on, having sort of gone on a journey in the first season with Tottenham, actually what Tottenham fans want and need, and what the club wants and needs, and how to break a narrative around the club. And he for him to gamble that hard and manage against what he was managing against inside the club. He talked publicly about leaks from inside the club, remember? And I know that I can't say everything I know, but I know some of the stuff he was managing against from inside the club, and it would blow some people's minds. And it was phenomenal what he did and what he actually ended up winning through that gamble. And I just think to not give him the chance to build on that is scandalous. I really do think. I think it's an act of cowardice, actually. I really do.
Matt, obviously, as Jamie touched upon there, we can't get away from there was, as we know, 22 league defeats in the season, 25.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'd
be intrigued to know from you, kind of, there was that 10-day period, wasn't there, of really everyone was in limbo. You know, fans were in limbo, journalists were in limbo, of course, of winning that Europa League final and what kind of came next. I mean, it'd be great to get a gauge from you why you felt there was such a long delay. Was it about trying to let the dust settle, let the fans enjoy the moment of winning that first trophy in 17 years, the first European trophy in over 40 years? Or was there genuine, maybe Daniel Levy behind the scenes actually really considering his options? I know many journalists reported the fact, I think, you know, midpoint towards the end of the season, that Tottenham were looking to make a change. So it'd be intriguing to get your feeling on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's my opinion, this is, but so I wrote early April that he was heading for the exit no matter what. I think earlier in the season, around Christmas time, they had considered sacking him at some point, and credit to them, they decided that they couldn't keep just revolving the wheel of sacking managers. They needed to try and go through a cycle with something, so they should take some credit there. But it became clear that the direction of travel was that he was going to go whatever. However, my opinion is that when they won that trophy, I think it took even the ownership and the board aback of the outpouring of celebration and emotion. I mean, it was incredible. You know, as someone who's not a Tottenham fan but has been around Tottenham a lot, I was surprised by it, and I thought it was phenomenal celebrations. I thought it was brilliant to see, and fantastic from the fans. And I think that took them aback. And I think that at that point, they didn't know what to do. Quite frankly, I think they still wanted to sack him, and clearly they did, because they ended up sacking him. But they didn't know how to deal with it, and I think that was disgraceful as well, because he was left. He went on holiday on the Monday after the Sunday of the Brighton game, the last game of the season, and he was just left in limbo. He was just left with absolutely no contact whatsoever. If they were going to do it, they should have called him up straight after that Brighton game and done it, and that would have been the brave thing to do. I still wouldn't have agreed with it, but they just left him hanging while they dithered and worried about how it would look for them. In my opinion, that is my opinion. I can't state that as a matter of fact. And my reading on it is that they did waver. And if I was to speculate why they then still carried on sacking him, I suspect he would have just been so powerful if he'd have been kept in place. He had that dressing room in his hand. You saw the speech, you saw the messages when he was sacked. He had that dressing room in his hand after the way he cocooned them in from the media, from parts of the rest of the club, from the outside world. He cocooned them in, and he had them in the palm of his hand. And then after winning the trophy, I think he probably had the majority of the fan base back in the palm of his hand. And I do think that there would have been people terrified by the power he could have held if he'd have stayed. Like I say, that is just my opinion.
Okay. Look, I know many want us to obviously move on to the new manager, and we're most certainly going to do that. And we're going to give Thomas Frank, of course, a lot of coverage during this show. But I think it's fair to say before we do that there feels that there's been a lot of change around the football club. But before Jamie comes and talks to you about that change, Daniel Levy, Vinay Venkatesan have done their own interviews recently. I just have to play the clip from Daniel Levy where he's put his neck on the line about what he hopes Tottenham can try and achieve in terms of some form of success, which we all want to bring into the show. But before we do, again, it's intriguing. I'm going to bring that in. But before I do, let me hand over to Jay and just maybe talk about the change that is happening. So, Jay, I'll hand back to you for a second and we'll try and bring it into the show.
Yeah, so of course we had change in the boardroom as well at Spurs. We know that Donna Cullen obviously departed her role. Of course, I think Scott Munn was placed on gardening leave. So we had those people departing, and then we've had Vinay Venkatesan obviously coming in as the new CEO. But of course, as you said, one man remains, and that was Daniel Levy. Of course, Joe Lewis as well, still the majority stakeholder at Spurs. But do you think that even with like a guy like Venkatesan coming in, do you think that Daniel Levy is still, anything's going to change whilst Daniel Levy is still at the football club, or is it just going to stay the same?
I can't see why anything would change while Daniel's at the football club. I know there's been a lot of sort of speculation around because of the changes, whether his sort of power is going to dilute or anything like that. I don't see it at all. He's run parts of the football club brilliantly. The stadium, the training ground, their PSR position. They've been in Champions League finals. You have to say he has run parts of the club brilliantly, but there is a lot lacking, and he's in my view been there way too long now. But I can't see a scenario where Daniel's there as chairman and that he relinquishes any control or any of the running of the club changes. I'd just be staggered. I can't see it at all.
Can I ask you about what have you made of the last 12, 18 months around the fact there's been active fan protests, probably the busiest or biggest we've actually ever seen from Tottenham fans? It's been quite difficult. We've seen in the past to get fans to actively protest against the football club. I'm just intrigued what you make of that from an outsider. That someone's covered the club for many, many years. And I think what we had 3,500 Tottenham fans protesting at one point during last season. Were you surprised by that? Or
yeah, I wrote a piece about it. It felt different because all of a sudden a lot of different factions of fans were actually coming together on one cause. I've always felt in previous years when there's been protests that it's been a little bit fractured, that it's been one group of fans and another group of fans hasn't liked it and another group of fans isn't really sure and all this kind of thing. But the whole sort of support the team, not the regime kind of thing that went along with this one felt different. And, the fact that the protesting would happen even when there were good results happening or goals being scored and things. It felt like fans before who had either been on the fence or not really appreciated the open protest against Daniel Levy and the board had actually come onto it now, and that it was far more coordinated and more. It wasn't one voice, because it never is with fans. Everyone's allowed their own opinion, but it felt like a bigger voice than it had been. So it felt significant.
I'll need to I'm intrigued to play you this clip, Matt, where, again, we know they've had that sit-down, Vinay Venkatesham and Daniel Levy, where these words have left Daniel Levy's mouth. And I'm intrigued to know what you make of it as a journalist that has covered the club so in depth over the last 2 decades.
What we haven't done that is more important. You need to win the league. We want to win the Premier League. We want to win the Champions League. We want to win.
It's big words, right? I mean, want to win the Premier League, want to win the Champions League. And, again, we're going to come on to obviously what Spurs are looking to try and do during this window. But I think you wrote a fascinating piece earlier in the season about Tottenham's position financially and maybe the constraints they've got at the moment. I don't know whether you can maybe go into a bit more detail with us on that, and whether you feel, given the difficulty situation they've got, along with the lowest revenue to wages ratio in the Premier League, is that realistic to think they can win the Premier League and win the Champions League on this current model?
No, it's completely unrealistic. It's complete nonsense. He's allowed to say he wants to. We all want lots of different things. I want to win Who Wants to Be a Millionaire whenever it's on or whatever. Do you know what I mean? You're allowed to want things, but in terms of a realistic aim under the current model and under the evidence that's been shown under 20-odd years of his chairmanship and ENIC's ownership, it's nonsense. It has to be written off as nonsense. I would go as far as predict that there's more chance of Ange Postecoglou getting a job and winning the Champions League or the Premier League than there is of Tottenham winning the Premier League in their current model, because history says you can't do it. The biggest indicator of how clubs finish in the league is the wage bill. Tottenham are 7th in the wage bill table. Villa are about 6th, I think. But after Villa, there's about 100 million gap between Tottenham and their other so-called rivals. That's the ratio you're putting up on the screen. But just in terms of the actual wage bill, they're about £100 million behind their rivals. So, they're just miles off on that. There's other little things as well that if you talk to sporting directors, how they measure it. A big thing is having homegrown play. If you look at a lot of the Premier League winning teams over the last however many years, they will also have significant appearances from homegrown players, whether it's one homegrown player, two, whether it's a Phil Foden, whether it's a Trent Alexander-Arnold. Arsenal haven't won the league, but they've obviously got Bukayo Saka. You need these kind of players at the core of the club. And apart from Harry Kane, and since Harry Kane, I know Mikey Moore's starting to come up, but Tottenham haven't had a homegrown player to make more than about sort of 5-10 appearances. So you can go through the metrics as well. There's loads of different data that sporting directors and clubs use about what brings together clubs that win Premier Leagues. And Tottenham are miles off on all of them. And some of it's stuff in theory you could fix quite quickly. And other parts of it is stuff that will take 5, 7, 8 years. You can't suddenly fix an academy to bring through a load of players for you unless they get some sort of investment either through ENIC or outside. How are they going to grow that wage bill? Or what is their plan to somehow produce a miracle and have the 7th highest wage bill and win the Premier League? You're looking at Leicester City type style of miracles to try and do something like that, even though it doesn't feel like that with Spurs, because Spurs are obviously a bigger club than Leicester. But you're asking for a miracle. You just ask. It's nonsense. You're allowed to want it, but in terms of a tangible aim, it's nonsense.
Do you think, Matt, on that point, that we're hoping or some significant investment to come in from the outside? Do you think that will be the key that's going to potentially give us a chance?
Yeah, well, look, the last set of accounts were fascinating, because the last set of accounts told us two things. Tottenham have a big problem with cash at the moment. They have the highest net transfer to still pay on all their deals, something like 250 million. In the whole league, they have the most money still left to play on outstanding transfers, because the way they do transfers. And they have spent money. obviously a lot of times we accuse ENIC and the board of not spending money. They have spent money, but they haven't spent the kind of money you need to win a league. And the problem is they've spent this money without investment into the club. ENIC haven't been really putting in any money whatsoever. And there's nothing really coming back in. When you compare them against other clubs of the investment they're either getting in from outside or the investment from their current owners, there's nothing coming back in. So there's no actual, it's hard to understand with Tottenham because they're in a brilliant PSR position. They've got all the PSR headroom in the world. In terms of actual cash to go out and spend on transfers, it's got really dangerously low. So we heard from Daniel a year ago on the accounts previous to the last one, where he said he actually came out and said they were looking for investment. Well, there's been no investment in that 12 months. And then on the last set of accounts, his statement was, we cannot spend what we haven't got. It's all there. It was all there in the accounts, and it's all there in what Daniel has. They either need ENIC to invest or they need outside investment, one or the other. Otherwise, they are hamstrung, and the only way they'll be able to buy players is by selling players. I personally think the changes, and what I'm told, the changes are because I think I've been told there is an acceptance that ENIC will have to invest some money because there isn't any outside investment at the moment, or certainly not significant, and therefore ENIC are taking a little bit of control back with some of these changes in return for putting some money into the club, because they recognise that otherwise the club are in not desperate straits in terms of the financial health of the club. The club aren't going anywhere, but in terms of being able to operate in the transfer window and not fall back even further, they're going to be in difficulty.
Yeah. Jay, I'll hand over to you because we've not seen many changes in the board in the last 20 years, but we've seen a significant one over the course of the last 6 weeks or so.
Yeah, of course. I said Vinay Venkatesham, of course, making the switch from Arsenal. Of course, he was out of work before he joined us, but it seems like a pretty interesting appointment, this one. Of course, as Ricky said, they did that joint interview together, him and Daniel Levy. He made a very big point about how they were going to be kind of joined at the hip and obviously always totally in line. He made big points about wanting to kind of speak with the supporters as well and really engage with that. And I mentioned on the last show how I felt that that they did feel like there had been a bit of a connection with the supporters formed a little bit in the away ends in the Europa League matches. We saw like the fans were engaged a bit more with like flags being put in the away ends and scarves. And so do you feel like he's going to really help with the relationship between the supporters and maybe the PR side of the club?
Yeah, I know quite a lot of people who cover Arsenal. I know colleagues who cover Arsenal very closely, and I know some people at Arsenal, and everyone speaks really highly of him, both as a operator and as a guy. I think he will be helpful. I think he'll be. It was clear from that interview he'll probably be helpful from a PR side. He's got more of a human touch to him. I think he will be better with the fans. I think he will help build some bridges with the fans, and that he will work hard to do that. And I also think, just taking it back to sort of transfers and stuff like that, I do think as well, we know that Daniel has good relationships with some clubs and not so good relationships with other clubs where they've been in these sort of big battles over things. And I think Vinay can probably pick up the phone to people who might not be quite so responsive to Daniel sometimes and help things from that perspective. So I do see him as a positive appointment. My only thing is, and this comes from again from covering the club for so long, we've seen a lot of these kind of appointments in the past who have barely lasted any time. We've seen lots of people come into this kind of either chief of operations or chief executive type roles, and they've really not lasted very long. And after sort of 12, 18 months, they've gone off and tended to do quite well somewhere else. Darren Eales is one. The guy at Brighton, is it Paul Barber?
Paul Barber,
another one. Yeah.
Yep.
There's other examples as well who don't come to me off the top of my head, but a lot of them end up not lasting long and going. So I really hope that he's allowed to do the work he wants, and that he's given the freedom to operate the way he wants. Because if he is, it feels like it could be positive.
Yeah, I think you make some examples there, Matt. And look, as fans, we've seen obviously over many, many different years, a number of these different type of people that kind of come into the building with real hope that as fans we're going to get that communication. And I really hope Vinay does something very much, clear, transparent talker. I mean, that first interview I thought was so polished. You know, it's not often as a Spurs fan that we've had an interview from somebody around the football club and you think, wow, this feels almost human. It almost feels like we're not being spoken to like we're robots. And I really, really hope, and we'll come on to Thomas Frank in a second, even like with Frank as the manager. I know you've seen Frank as well, Matt, in a number of different press conferences, both home and away in different games. I really hope with the people that we're bringing in now, they do not lose that human touch. Because I think it's very clear to see that with Frank, who's an excellent communicator, I think it was terrific in his first interview. And Vinay also in that first interview that he gave, you know, there was real, I thought, clear guidelines in terms of what they want to achieve when they're here. And I really don't hope that the Tottenham virus, but the Tottenham way or the nature of Tottenham as a club doesn't beat it out of them, because we've missed for a long time, I think, clear communication from the very, very top and downwards. Matt, would you agree?
Yeah, totally. There's not really been any communication from the top for years, to be quite honest with you. You know, Daniel doesn't speak to the press. Lots of owners and chairmen don't speak to the press, but there's not been anyone really under him either who would be available to speak to the press and therefore speak to the fans. And I think there has been a vacuum in that position, and it's not been healthy for the club. I do think there's actually a really good media department at Tottenham. I have to say they're very well respected throughout the game, and I think you could see that in some of the social media stuff and media stuff they did around the cup win. I thought some of it was absolutely excellent. And there is actually a good media team, but again, I think they've sometimes had to work under certain constraints of not being able to necessarily do things always the way they would choose to do things. So hopefully this gives them a little bit more a bit more space to do what they want to and be a bit more creative. And yeah, I just think it's really important, because they've got to find some sort of connection between the club and the fans, because we've seen it so many times. You can't really achieve anything if that connection's broken. It just becomes impossible.
Yeah, very, very true. I totally agree on that. Look, we're going to squeeze in our first break of the show for our listeners and audio. When we come back, we are talking about Thomas Frank. We're switching to Frank Fever. We're also going to discuss where Tottenham are in this transfer window, where they have, as things stand at the moment, looks like they're closing in on their second signing of this current summer. TAKAI looks like he's coming through the doors very, very slowly at Hotspur Way. Let's hear, though, from both Vinay Venkatesham and Thomas Frank directly on what hopefully the future is going to hold for Tottenham Hotspur.
So we ran a really, really thorough process at Speed. We defined 10 characteristics that we think are important to be a successful manager at Tottenham Hotspur. We analysed in real detail, through our technical staff led by Johan, more than 30 candidates. We had a shortlist. We spent a lot of time with the shortlist, and Thomas was absolutely the number one candidate, and could not be more excited to have him join the club.
In few words, the intention is to play aggressive, front-footed football, and I know the ethos and the history of the club is massive on attacking football, and I think there's so much attacking talent in the squad. I'm very excited about that. They've clearly shown over the last 2 seasons that the ability to score goals is fantastic, and I'm very, very in on that. I love a team that is scoring goals. Very, very big on principles. What we do on the final third in terms of creating chances, crosses, spring balls in the box, play behind and stuff like that. I think it's key. So just want to build on that attacking football we already have here in the club. I always say this one-liner: if you don't take risk, you also take risk. So I think it's important that we take risk. And risk is, for example, if we play man-man in some situations. Risk is you need to play forward. If you don't risk the ball, you can't create anything. So I'm a big believer of that. We need to be brave. The players need to be brave when we play, and they need to trust themselves. So I will do my very best to install that trust, and the players need to be brave. For me, if they lose the ball by trying, it's never a problem for me. Of course, I can react. It's natural, but they need to do that. But if they don't work hard, that I struggle more with that. So if they do everything they can and they lose the ball or they try, no problem. But it's more if they don't work hard, that's my non-negotiable. But we need to take risk. Of course, if we don't take risk, it's impossible to achieve something big.
So there you go. That was Thomas Frank, Tottenham Hotspur's new head coach. Thank you so much. As we return from the break, we've got over 5,500 of you that are watching the show live. Thank you so much for all your incredible support for Last Word on Spurs. I know many out there are intriguingly waiting for Tottenham to really kickstart their summer transfer window. I know there's a lot of big names that people want to see through the door. We know as Tottenham fans, we're usually having to wait for those potential big names. We're going to hear from Matt on some of those. But let's turn our attention to Thomas Frank and Jay. I will hand over to you to kickstart this second part of Last Word on Spurs.
Yes, of course, Thomas Frank, the man that was come in. Of course, he spoke as we saw there about playing, attacking or trying to maintain that attacking brand of football. He of course also mentioned about how this squad have now won, and of course they are winners, but it is now about making them serial winners. Of course, we've already discussed the limitations that the players, and I'm sure Thomas Frank, are going to be working under, like all the previous managers and players that have come through the door at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. So, Matt, would just be really interested to kind of get your take on the appointment of Thomas Frank and whether you think it was the right one.
Yeah, look, I mean, parking my feeling on whether Ange should have been sacked or not, completely parking that to one side. In terms of Thomas himself, I think it's a good appointment. I've always been very impressed with him. I've covered bits and bobs of Brentford. Always liked his press conference. Always liked the way he's held himself. Liked the fact that he's proved himself to be adaptable with that team and squad over a long period of time through the Championship and the Premier League. And I do rate it as an appointment. I think it's a good appointment and the right appointment in the circumstances. He's proved himself someone who can work within budgets. He doesn't need to go out and demand world stars or unrealistic expectations. He can improve players. He's proved that a lot in the past, which I think is going to be key. And like I say, that adaptation, if you look at his Brentford team who are in the Championship, they're actually very, very attractive and expansive and sort of goal scoring. And then he came up to the Premier League and realised very quickly, actually, we can't play like that to start with in the Premier League. And where we see some managers rigidly stick to the way that it got them up, he actually created a whole different way to keep them up. And to achieve what he's achieved on their budget, people sometimes, group them in with sort of Brighton and Bournemouth, Brentford of what they've achieved. But actually what he's achieved is far bigger, because when you look at their budget and what they've spent, it's so much lower than Brighton and Bournemouth. They're always at the bottom budget-wise. And they've massively overachieved. And part of that is their overall structure, but a lot of it is Thomas Frank too. And I think he's a really sound appointment. And he's also brought some really good backroom staff in with him by all accounts. So I think it's a good appointment. And I'm optimistic about what he can do at the club for sure.
I know Justin Cochran was one of the guys that came in. I mean, he obviously seems like someone that is pretty highly rated. I know he seemed like he was a candidate for the Brentford job. So I guess he's someone that maybe Spurs fans should be excited about as well, right?
Really highly rated. He's in the England setup as well. He's very highly rated within the England setup. Thomas Tuchel took him into there. He's obviously worked at Tottenham in the past, so he knows the sort of fabric of the club as well, which I think is good. And you hear a lot of good things about him, that he looks like a really strong backroom appointment. Can
I roll two into one? I'm just conscious of time. Jamie's going to come in and talk about potentially Spurs' second signing of the summer in a second. I want to ask you, Matt, about both Johan Langer's role at Spurs and also Fabio Paratigi's. I'm intrigued to see how this does play out, because it does feel that Langer's obviously known Frank for quite a long time, so it feels very much a kind of driven appointment where Langer would have known Frank's profile and background, and it feels maybe you might have sold him to the board. Be keen to get your thoughts on that, and also what the future holds for Fabio Paratici. Of course, it's never been a dull moment for him in the last 18 months. I know many are wondering whether he'll come back full-time at Tottenham. What can you tell us about those two and how they may work together in tandem down the line, potentially?
Well, look, they've worked in tandem together before, obviously. Paratici's never really gone away. He's not been able to have a staff job at Spurs, but he's been on a contract. He's a contracted consultant, and that contract runs till the end of August, as we currently are. So he's got this summer transfer window in his consultancy role still, as I say, with a contract. So he's never really gone away. He's carried on playing quite a big role in that setup. So Lang knows how he operates. I do think that they do fulfill quite different roles. Langer is very much a data, a strategy guy. his strengths very much seem to lie in spotting young talent and talent that can really add value and, potentially make money, or certainly buy players who are going to go up highly in value. If you look what he did at Villa with John Duran, Douglas Luiz, I think he was involved. And then if you look at Tottenham with Archie Gray and Lucas Bergvall, particularly Bergvall, he played a huge part in. That's kind of where his main strengths lie, I would say, from what I know of him. Paratici a different kind of guy. He can get on the phone to any top chief executive in Europe. He can get on the phone to any of the top agents. I'm not saying Langer can't, but that is Paratici's real strength. And also his real strength is, Tottenham are in a dicey situation in the transfer window when they missed out on Luis Diaz. He managed to pick up the phone. He got Kulusevski. He got Benton Kerr. He can quickly do those deals. He's also very handy for selling players because he has such a wide-reaching network around Europe and, friendships and relationships. He's very useful for selling players. So I do think they have roles that can work together. Whether that's a long-term thing will remain to be seen, because they would obviously have some different thoughts, and it's quite where Langer now sees himself, whether he really sees himself as the top man or whether he's prepared to sort of work in tandem with someone. And quite frankly, Paratici can either come back in a full-time role, or they could sign another contract as a consultant. It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you, unless he actually takes a role at a different club. But add into the fact that in June 2026, he can actually apply for his British citizenship, which I'm told he is interested in doing. So it makes sense for him to stay in this country to work as well.
Cool. Jay, I'll hand back to you and finally come on to the subject I know many want to know is about transfers. Jay, let's hand over and discuss these potential transfers.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you mentioned about Langer, and obviously one of his strengths being identifying young players. Of course, it seems like he has done that. Obviously, we've seen Tottenham agreeing a £5 million fee for 20-year-old Japanese international Kota Takai. Obviously, a really interesting signing, this one, a central defender who already has plenty of experience despite his age. Obviously, I think it's 4 appearances for the national team already. I think he's made 78 appearances at senior level in obviously the top Japanese league. We've seen him feature in the Asian Champions League where he came up against the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo and Sadio Mane, got the better of them. They won 3-2 and got to the final. Of course, the other one who has come through the door, obviously a player Spurs fans already know, Mathys Tel, £30 million. He was signed from Bayern Munich. So obviously, just in terms of Thomas Frank and his role in the transfer window, just be interesting to get your take on the say that he'll have and the control that Thomas Frank will have over transfers and maybe the positions that he might be looking to sign this summer.
Yeah, look, I think it was the same with Ange as well. I think he will have a strong say. They're not going to sign players who he's dead against or can't see the point of signing. I'd imagine that he had a fairly big say on Tel, because that's a lot of money. You can't be signing Tel for a manager who isn't sure whether he'd have a role for him or whether he'd want to play him or how he'd want to use him. That's a decent wedge of money. So I would imagine that he would have had a big say on that transfer and that he would have a very clear plan for Tel and decided that he can suit his system to play an active role immediately. Now, obviously, Takai is slightly different. We're told he's going to be a first-team player, but he looks far more like what you'd call a Johan Langer signing, someone to come in, be around the squad, but really work towards sort of developing and really adding a lot of value in time and becoming a big player who will prove to be a bargain. And I'd have thought that, as I say, that would go through Frank still, because again, he would need to sign on to the sort of pathway for him. But I think that would be less so for him and more something for Langer to be saying to the club, look, this is a lad who can, be around the squad now and sort of is at a level where he can compete for a place, but B, and more saliently, his value can really grow and grow and grow. And we see his ceiling being this high, and this is how we're going to take him there. And that seems to be where Langer's big strength lies.
Yeah.
And they need players like that, because they need some players to come in. I think next year Bergvall will count, He won't this year, but next year Bergvall will count on the homegrown list. Archie Gray will eventually count on the homegrown list.
Yeah.
You know, if you can't bring them through your own academy, because that is, let's face it, that's difficult. And as I said at the start of the show, that takes 5, 6, 7 years to sort of start seeing players come through your academy. The other way to do it is to bring in these kind of young players who can eventually become almost homegrown through growing up at the club.
Obviously, another player that we will see, a younger player come into the club this summer. I think he signed, was it 2 years ago? Luka Vuskovic. Obviously the young Croatian lad? Is he someone that, do we know about the plans for him and obviously working alongside TAKAI?
I don't at the moment. There is talk about him going on loan again, but I'd imagine Frank will want to see him. Usually when you get a new head coach and they want to have a look at some of them in pre-season, you know, this lad, you hear it. I've seen clips on him. He looks very good on clips.
Yeah.
I haven't actually seen him in the flesh or anything like that, I'll be honest. But people talk about him very highly. I know he's very highly rated and there's excitement around him. And like I say, if you've got a new head coach, they tend to want to have a little look at them before they decide. But it might be that he takes another loan, or takes a loan. Sorry, it feels like he's been on loan, but he hasn't, has he? Because he joined and then stayed at his club.
Yeah, I mean, I think many are intrigued, Matt. Look, I think these last couple of seasons, it's been about, as we've seen with Tottenham, signing young, promising players that are ultimately going to hopefully develop into real, true superstars. And normally with Tottenham, they would go and sell them on for a fee. But the reality is, I think we're at a point now with the squad. I know Ange actually said this in his parting press conference after that Brighton game, that he felt there's a real need to bring in some experienced players that have been there, maybe done it and won it, but certainly players that are a lot more accustomed to having that element of experience. How much do you think, Matt, this window for Tottenham is going to be about bringing in a bit more experience to the squad rather than there being a primary focus on young talent, which, to be fair, it feels a club have gone from one degree to another. I know a lot of fans, get excited by young players, but at the same time, I think, if you asked a Tottenham fan what their last big wow signing was, they'd probably say it was Rafael van der Vaart. I know, Matt, you were covering the club back then. So, I mean, what's your take on that for you?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, you're right. Ange was very much of the opinion that from now on, there needed to be some experience added to that club. Now, experience can mean two things. Experience can mean age, but you can also have experience through appearances and playing in competition, certain European competitions and things that don't necessarily require that you're 28, 29, 30, 31. So experience doesn't always just equate to being old, as it were. But yeah, certainly I think experience, there does need to be a smattering of experience, a better balance of bringing in experience. And just looking at the way Frank has done things, I know that he's had success, obviously, bringing in players, and Brentford had success bringing in players from sort of lower leagues, whether it be in Europe or whatever. But a lot of them did have a lot of experience in terms of amounts of matches played and also ages and things like that. I would be surprised if Frank didn't want some experience in some certain positions there. I'd imagine that's what he's looking at.
Obviously, one player that we have that does have a lot of experience at the club at the moment is Heung-Min Son, of course, our legendary captain, who just lifted the Europa League trophy. Obviously, a very special moment, that. Obviously, his future is completely up in the air at the moment, being linked with moves to Saudi Arabia. I think, obviously, it doesn't seem like that one that will happen. The MLS. What do you think is going to happen with Sonny's future this summer? Do you think it's going to be a case of just waiting to see what happens when he's had that chance to have a chat with Thomas Frank?
I mean, certainly after the last match of the season, he left people both in the dressing room and around the staff with the impression that he might have played his last game for Tottenham. The way he said his goodbyes for the summer and stuff did leave people with the impression that he thought he could go. I think there is a willingness from Tottenham's perspective to do a deal if he feels the time is right now that he's won that trophy and that the time might be right for both parties. The complication is, and this has been out in the media, that obviously the touring career, there is money riding on that contract in Son being part of that tour, and Tottenham would lose a significant amount of money from that tour were Son to go before that. So it looks like they'll have to certainly wait to do anything until after that tour, which may not be for the best of all worlds in terms of just planning your summer and getting through everything. there's definitely been Saudi interest, and there has been talk that Sonny has been interested in going out to Saudi once his Tottenham career ended. So I wouldn't write off that one yet. I do think there is a fairly decent chance that he will go at some point this summer. I would rate it over 50% at the moment.
Okay, so it's one to keep an eye on.
So one to keep an eye on. When you talk about leaders and the need for experience as well, you lose a leader in Sonny, and there's big doubts over Cristian Romero's future, who's a massive leader as well. So if you do lose two real leaders, you're going to have to bring some leaders in.
Yeah. I have to ask you about Romero, Matt, just to get your take on it, because he's a fascinating character, Romero. Obviously, when he does ever give an interview, they're normally quite explosive, I think it's fair to say. Obviously, we've not had one yet, bless him, in English, because he's never really given that to the camera. But, it often feels that when he is, as I said, making these interviews, or the timing of them, they're very precise, they're to the point, they're to try and really give a headline. And, it took 56 minutes after the appointment of Thomas Frank for Romero's post to drop, to wish Ange Postecoglou all the very, very best. And obviously the line that stuck out from Romero's post was the element of saying, from day one, you paved the way despite the many obstacles that always existed and always will exist. Now, look, you can interpret that in a couple of different ways, because is he interpreting just the nature of Tottenham as a club? Is he having another go at the board? It wouldn't be the first time, he's questioned the board's ambition. I know a lot of fans don't really mind the fact he's questioned the board's ambition, because a lot of us do that on a regular basis here on Last Word on Spurs, and as fans in general, we question the board. So there definitely is that argument that some feel Romero's words in the past have been spot on. I know there's a lot of fans out there also feel Romero that the biggest concern about him is lack of availability. I think he only played a third of last season. I think Jamie said it on the last show, the amount of games he did play. I don't know if you've got the number to hand again, Jay. How many games do you remember how many games he played? Was it 20?
Something like 20. I think it was something like 28 games that he missed because of injuries. So obviously, ridiculous.
So for a player that is so important to the club, and we saw how influential he was in that final, and I personally think he won Tottenham that final by the way he rattled Harry Maguire on a number of occasions during that final, and clearly he's got over the line. What do you think the future holds for Romero, and do you think it was disrespectful, the timing of that post for the incoming Thomas Frank?
It wasn't disrespectful to Thomas Frank, I don't think. There was nothing I sensed in it that was a pop at Thomas Frank. I read it as being disrespectful to the board, and like you say, some fans and a lot of people would back him for doing that. I can't believe that the timing was a coincidence. He'd had the best part of 2 weeks to put out a thank you to Ange and put out his message, and he put it out basically just after the news had dropped about the new manager. So it felt calculated. I can't get into his head and know for sure it was, and it felt like a pop at the board. When you talk about how important he was in that final, I still remember. I watched it. I know it's been put on social media since I was in the stadium, and I watched him march the players to do the huddle in front of the Tottenham fans in the Man United end. It was genius. It was just utter genius, and it's a bit like those Argentine players who have won the World Cup and won those Copa Americas with Argentina. You see it with Emi Martinez at Villa as well. They are masters in some of these dark arts and some of these ways of getting into people's heads. And Romero is he's a phenomenal player, and he's absolutely phenomenal at the way he can get into people's heads as well. And I do think there's clearly a problem there. I could only read his message being one way in terms of the problems that will always exist. And it will be fascinating when he's back to see, A, whether he comes back, B, if he comes back and he can get over the Ange thing. We saw with James Maddison, who was clearly very attached to Ange. He can park his feelings on Ange because you saw his reaction to Thomas Frank. Exactly. Now, can Romero might be able to do that as well. But can Romero, that's the question, the great image to put up. That's the question mark we're going to have on Romero. Can he park his feelings on Ange and also what he seems to think on the board in terms of his now relationship going forward with Thomas Frank? And that's the great unanswered question at the moment.
Do you think, Matt, very quick before Jamie comes back in, I've questioned the hierarchy a lot of the club, but would it be a real statement of intent if they went to Cristian Romero and tried to offer him a new contract and make him arguably what might be the highest paid player at the football club? Many might feel that's not right to do that, but many might feel, look, he's a winner. We've just spoke about the way he marched the team into that huddle in the final. you want to try and keep your best players. What my worry is, what message does that send out, Matt, to the rest of the group if you're willing to let your best players go at this football club? How do you come at that from an outsider?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's difficult, though. I mean, if he feels as we think he may feel from his post and from sort of things he said in the past, it's very difficult to be able to commit to him unless he's going to actually sit down and say, you know, I am willing to sort of believe in what you say and believe in the way forward. You know, you can't just give a player a ton of cash and a massive contract if you can't actually get them on board with the way you're doing things. But I do also hear what you're saying. You know, the biggest statement of intent in a way would be actually to go to him and say, you know, here you are, we want to sort of build a club around you. But it's very difficult to do that if the guy doesn't believe in the way the club want to do things. So it's a very difficult situation.
And just one final point before Jay does come back in, I promise. I mean, Simeone's now publicly gone on record to say he likes Romero.
Yeah, which is a disgrace. I want to jump in. It's a disgrace, by the way. He shouldn't be doing that. It's completely disrespectful to Tottenham. It's disrespectful to Thomas Frank. It's a little bit. Romero might like it, but it also leaves Romero in an awkward position. You know, managers shouldn't be doing that. And if that was another manager in the Premier League, all hell would break loose over that. And I suspect if another manager was doing that about a Liverpool player or another club's player, we'd hear a lot more about it as a disgrace. And for whatever reason, because it's Tottenham, we don't necessarily hear it. Simeone's a disgrace for doing that. He shouldn't be doing that.
Matt, sorry, gut feeling, Matt, Romero staying or going. Do you have a gut feeling on it?
Gut feeling is going, but you know the asking price will be massive. But gut feeling at the moment is going, but it's not going to be an easy deal for anyone to do.
Okay, I'm sick of that talking about players that are leaving. Jay, talk about players that might be coming for us, please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, obviously on Romero, I mean, as Ricky said, it's, you know, to lose a player like that would just be a really bad message, I feel like, to the fans in terms of the club's ambition, the players as well. Because he's going to be, you know, he is such an important player, as you said, you know, the way he marched the players over to the Spurs end in the final, the way he captained, the way his performance, for me, it's just, yeah, it'll be really disappointing to see him go. And as you said, a really top player. Obviously, as Ricky said, we're talking about incomings now. One player that Spurs had been hoping to try and persuade to come to Tottenham was Bryan Mbeumo. Obviously, someone who did fantastically well under Thomas Frank last season. 20 Premier League goals, which is quite some achievement. The issue is, obviously, we know that Manchester United are firmly in the mix, and it seems like they look like they've put the money on the table now that might get the deal done. So, Matt, obviously, was kind of your understanding on the Mbeumo situation?
Yeah, what I do know is that Man United are very confident and optimistic that they're going to get this over the line. They've felt all along, they say that they've had messaging that Mbeumo only wants to join Manchester United. There's some suggestion he might have been a Manchester United fan at some stage. Also, it feels like there's been talks going on in the background for quite a while, and the package on offer is very, very tempting to him. Yeah, United are very confident on it, so you've got to think they're confident for a reason. You know, they've put the second bid in now that seems to be close. It feels like the direction of travel is that he's going to go to Man United. Clearly, Thomas Frank would love to work with him again. He is a player of experience. You know, both. You know, he's not old, but age-wise, he's got experience. He's got a lot of Premier League experience. He's got the data to back him up. He'd be a fantastic signing, but I do feel it's more likely he goes to Manchester United at the moment. It's interesting, though, that they're interested in him because clearly they're interested in that position. You know, Semenyo's another one they're interested in. They're clearly interested in someone who can play off the right side, which, you know, I know fans are split on him a little bit, but it's also a little bit of a surprise because Thomas Frank did try very, very hard to buy Brennan Johnson when he was Brentford manager from Nottingham Forest. You know, they made club record bids. I think they might have even made 5 bids for him. Brennan Johnson was Tottenham's top goal scorer in the last season, and obviously that incredibly important goal in the final. So I do think that Brennan Johnson is someone that Frank should be probably quite excited to work with, but he obviously feels that he needs someone else in that position. Maybe he thinks he needs a bit more competition around him or someone that Brennan Johnson can learn from a little bit, or someone that offers something different, because it seems to be an area of the pitch they've quickly identified they'd like to sign a player in.
Can I ask you, Matt? I know time's up against us. Just on the fact of around Mbeumo obviously leaving Brentford, he hasn't been the only player that's been linked away from the football club. I mean, it looks like there's an exodus happening in Brentford at the moment. How difficult would that be to see any kind of player follow their way to Tottenham as well, along with Frank? I know there's been the likes of Wissa, there's been Nathan Collins, there's been, I think, Norgard looks like he's now joining Arsenal from what we're seeing. How realistic is it? Do you think there's any way Frank can bring any players from Brentford should he wanted to Tottenham? Is that highly unlikely?
What I always think with coaches when they go into clubs, and the reason why they quite often like to just bring one if they can with them, is that they can talk to the dressing room and act to someone in the dressing room to help people get on board with the coach's ideas. They can really get in amongst the lads a little bit and talk to them, because it can take a coach a while to convince players about their methods and things, because things don't happen overnight. And if you've got a player in there who really buys into you and who is someone who will talk to the group a little bit, you can get someone in who helps you manage that group a little bit, especially through the early weeks. So I think it's really helpful from that point of view. But yeah, I do think it's going to be, once Brentford have lost Mbeumo and Norgard, surely there comes a point where they have to just say no to anything, because otherwise they'll be in a complete mess for next season.
Yeah, agree. I'll hand back over to Jay. Jay, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there one of the targets maybe that might be coming in, or someone that Spurs are looking at anyway. Semenyo looks like Brighton, Bournemouth, have set a very high valuation on him. It seems like it's around the £70 million mark. He had a very good season, obviously 13 goals in 42 appearances. But is that sort of fee that Spurs are going to pay?
No. I can't see them paying that fee in a million years. And also, there's a similar problem there in that Bournemouth have already lost two of their best players. They've lost Kirkes and they've lost Howson early in the window. And, you do tend to find with clubs that they turn off the tap at some stage, unless they're in massive financial problems that we don't know about. Once they've sold one or two, they'll turn off the tap unless it's like 80, 90, 100 million, because you can't be selling more than two of your very best players and have any ambition of doing anything the following season. So I think that brings with it a massive problem that Bournemouth, and PSG are even finding it difficult to get Zabiani out of there because of that. So I think it will be difficult for anyone to buy Semenyo, and I just don't see Tottenham going high enough. And actually, Semenyo is a really good player, but in terms of £70 million, not for me. That's an insane amount of money. When you think that someone like Eze has got a 60 million release clause, I know he's not the same position quite as those players we've talked about, but Eze for me at 60 million, and I know that the clause is meant to be complicated. If someone gets him this window, I think he'll be one of the deals of the window. I just think he's an absolute guarantee. He's a phenomenally good player. I know a little bit about him from covering England. Phenomenally good lad. No problem at all in the dressing room. I just think he's an absolute guarantee for someone. And a bit like when Arsenal signed, I know, completely different player, but when Arsenal signed Declan Rice, even though it was 100 million, I just thought it's a guarantee. He's going to be an 8 out of 10 signing for you, if not higher. It's a guarantee. I see that with Eze. Different position, different player. But whoever buys him has got an 8 out of 10 player straight away, and he might be better than that too. And at a good price.
Yeah. I'll hand back to Jay, because there's a couple of other players to wrap up in terms of that wing area. Jay, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, I mean, we'll obviously talk a little about Eze in just a second, and obviously Spurs' interest. I mean, for me, as you say, he is someone that I absolutely love as well, and I think he is going to be a brilliant player. Two more players that potentially linked, and obviously just what your understanding of maybe what they're at, where they're at. Mohammed Kudus, obviously there has been a little bit of talk about him, and obviously I believe he has a release clause at West Ham as well, around £80 million, which is obviously crazy money. Another player as well is RB Leipzig's Xavi Simons, another player who I'm a massive fan of. Obviously, England fans will know him. Scored against England in the European Championships back in 2014 in the semi-finals for the Netherlands. Do we know anything about those two players? Obviously, Kudus and Xavi Simons.
So Xavi Simons does want to come to England this summer, and he will leave Leipzig. He's got quite a few people looking at him. And I am told that Tottenham are definitely one of those, that there is an interest from Tottenham in him. I don't think it's an easy deal to do. I think he wants, from what I'm told, I think he wants quite a big package himself. I don't think the transfer fee would necessarily be something that would be a problem for Tottenham or other clubs. But I think in terms of what he's looking for in terms of his package, I think is quite high, I'm told. But I do think Tottenham are in the mix for him and certainly are interested. But I think there are a few, so I don't certainly think they're going to have a clear run. And I think there are a few in England. So I don't see it being easy. And I don't necessarily, say he's their top choice, but they're definitely interested. I definitely think they have a shout. Let's put it like that. On Kudus, West Ham, from what I'm told, are desperate to sell him. They have to sell players to buy, and Kudus is their player who they feel that they can sell to help really reshape the squad and hope to get as much money as possible. I think there's an acceptance at West Ham that they're not going to get the release clause that they maybe thought they would have got this time last year had they have sold him. But they'd still want 60 million plus for him, and he's not had a brilliant season, albeit I do think he's a very good player and he can play in sort of a range of positions. I don't know on Tottenham's level of interest in him, I've got to be honest. I just know that West Ham do want to sell him to try and fund a rebuild.
Okay, look, before we do look for a close on this show, I mean, you mentioned to Jamie, I'm sorry, Jay, to steal your thunder about him, because I know you're gagging for Eze to come to Tottenham. Matt, you said there for you, it's an 8 out of 10 player. Obviously, his situation around the release clause is an interesting one. We're hearing reports that there's an opportunity where it could be paid in instalments rather than, I think, what we've been told previously. You've got to go to Palace and up front hand over quite a big amount of cash. I look at that player. He looks like a Tottenham player to me. I know you're not a Tottenham fan, Matt, but, do you have a gauge on where he might go? Because I know there's a lot of journalists that have suggested out there that, with City maybe selling Grealish, would they maybe turn their attention to someone like Eze?
City are interested in him. City have been interested since last summer. They've never bid for him yet, but City definitely holds an interest in him and him. They haven't moved yet, and they've spent a lot of money already. So whether their interest in Eze would now have to wait until whatever happens with Grealish, whether they sell or loan him, whether there's other movement that might have to happen. But they certainly like him, and he's certainly been on their radar. I mean, I don't, the clause, all I'm ever told about the clause is it's complicated. And I know that part of it relates to Champions League. So that's a bonus to Tottenham because they are in the Champions League now. And I do think there's maybe two elements to the clause, and it becomes easier for Champions League clubs than non-Champions League clubs. But he does look like, like you say, I'm not a Tottenham fan, but he does look like a Tottenham player. It's a bit lazy to say it, but he's looked after by Base. We know that Base have a great relationship with Tottenham. They do a lot of business in and out of Tottenham. I don't really agree with people who say that, there's nowhere for him to play with Maddison and Kulusevski there. I could see you fitting them all in. And in the Champions League, you've got to have such a strong squad as well. You've got to have a squad. It's not about just the players who start. So I think it'd be an incredible signing. And as someone who watches Tottenham a lot, I'd love to be going to watch Tottenham and watch Eze play for Tottenham because I love watching him.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal player. Before Jay comes in and asks you the final question, there has been this kind of talk around the fact, Matt, and you spoke about it earlier, not just the situation around their finances, but the also concern they've got around this situation about club homegrown players and the trained element to that. And I know they've been linked with a move for Kyle Walker-Peters. I mean, is this just a Tottenham thing, or is this a concern for just Tottenham alone, the fact that they've got this issue around this kind of homegrown quota?
No, other clubs have got, Nottingham Forest have got a big problem with the homegrown quotas for Europe as well. Certain clubs get themselves into these positions with the homegrown stuff, and the European one's always a bit more complicated because, for instance, it's always the famous one at Tottenham that Ben Davies doesn't count as homegrown, does he? Because of the Welsh thing. There's always seems to be a little difficulty around it. Obviously, Fraser Forster would have been one of the homegrown ones, and he's now left the squad. So there is a bit of an issue there. Look, it's not an insurmountable issue. They can solve it, but there might be a signing like a Kyle Walker-Peters or someone else. I mean, Kyle Walker-Peters ticks two boxes because he's not just homegrown; he's actually club trained as well. Because he came through at Tottenham. But there might be a signing like that who helps. I think if you remember last season, Villa re-signed Philogene. That was all to do with their homegrown and club trained quotas as well. it's not just a Tottenham thing. We shouldn't batter Tottenham for it. It's a little issue they'll have to solve this summer, and they will. They have to, and they will.
Yep. Yeah. Listen, Jay, I'll hand over to you to wrap us up. It's been a great show. Over to you, Jay.
Yeah, of course. So obviously next season going to be really interesting one at Tottenham. Obviously, as you said, Champions League football back. We're going to start to try and climb the table. We have to start climbing the table. Obviously, finishing 17th last season. Thomas Franke is walking into a very interesting job here at Spurs. As we know, he's going to have to work alongside a chairman in Daniel Levy. There's going to be lots of competition next year as well. We know all the teams in the Premier League now, the likes of Newcastle, Chelsea, and then, of course, you've got the rest of the big six. So in terms of what are the targets for Spurs next year, and obviously with Thomas Frank being his first year, what are you kind of expecting from Thomas Frank and maybe what he needs to achieve?
It's really interesting because the fact that Ange has won a trophy and being sacked makes it really difficult. Look, they'll be looking to fight for Champions League again. I don't think he has to qualify for the Champions League, but they'll expect to be in that top 6-7 mix where they're all fighting. I think every season now that there's a 5th Champions League place, if you're around the top 7, you're going to be going into the final fixtures fighting for a Champions League place. Now, I think there'll be an expectation that they fight for a Champions League place. They'll want to get out the league phase of the Champions League, and then after that, it's all about draw and stuff like that. So you can't put too much more on them. And they'll want a run in the cups. But what he probably does have to do, what we've seen cost Ange, is he has to be able to sort of balance on all fronts. And the squad as it is might not be capable of doing that. So that is difficult. But it's clear that they expect him to be able to balance on all fronts, and that he has to sort of probably put the league first, because Ange flipped it on its head and put the cup first, and it kind of cost him his job. But Frank's going to have to finish in that sort of top 7, top 6 and fight for the Champions League, I'd imagine. It's really difficult, though. It's really difficult to actually pin. Some clubs and some managers, you can pin what they need to do. And in the past with Tottenham, when Conte came in, it was all about just getting in the top 4. When Jose came in, it was about trying to win a trophy. It's a much harder thing to pin it on now. I just really hope he's supported. I'm not talking to fans. I think the fans will support him. I actually think the Tottenham fans are excellent. But I mean, from the club, I just hope he's supported and given time, because he's going to need support and time to succeed from the club. And I just really hope he's given that.
I also agree with you, Matt. I mean, the biggest thing I always find a lot of managers when they get to Tottenham is when they walk in, they then realise what they've got to work with, and then realise they need to have more established players around them. And that's my only concern for him, that look, he's got a decent squad there, and it definitely isn't the squad that should be finishing 17th. I think he will get us back up the table, but I still think if the remit is to come in and not only improve the league position, but as you said as well, they kind of fight on all 4 fronts, they're going to need, in my opinion, a lot of experience in this summer window to try and bring in and help him. I hope by the end of the window, I really, really hope he's going to get that. And again, it's one of those things where I guess with Tottenham, time's going to tell, Matt, whether they will give him that support, right?
That's what I talk about. He needs support. He needs support, and he needs backing. Otherwise, it's pointless. And we've seen now the expanded Champions League and the new league phase. It's brutal. It is absolutely brutal. And you if you don't finish in the top 8, you're going to play 10 league games before you even get to a last 16. The way it's gone in the Champions League is so brutal. Trying to combine that with both the Premier League and the cups, you've got to give the people, you've got to give the managers the tools to do it with. You can't just ask them to provide miracles. It's not fair on them. Yeah.
It's going to be fascinating. It always is with Tottenham, most certainly. Matt, I want to say a massive thank you. We know how busy you are across the summer, so we really, really do appreciate you.
Sorry, the lights have gone out on me, guys. I can't reach for a light in this room, and it was all bright when we started, and now it's in the dark.
Listen, as Tottenham fans, we're used to the lights going out on us. I wouldn't worry about it. We're constantly trying to find the light switch in as Tottenham fans. But look, we've got a massive light switch, of course, at the end of the season. We're hoping there's going to be a lot more bright lights to come. Matt, where can we find the wonderful work you do, not only for Tottenham, but I know, again, around the footballing community? Tell us where you're going to be across the summer.
Well, across the summer, it's a rare quiet summer. I was at the Euros last summer, and I'm in the States for the World Cup next summer. So this is a rare quiet summer for me. So I enjoyed the cricket that just finished. I'm going to be trying to watch as many of those tests as I can. and obviously just keeping up with the news and it ticking up. But it comes around so quick. I mean, I think a lot of the non-international players of Premier League clubs are starting to filter back in, you know, a week on Monday or so like that. So it quickly starts again. And I'll be on some of those I'm not on the big pre-season tour, but I'll be on some of the pre-season matches and things like that. So yeah, it'll come around quick enough.
It always does. Matt, massive thank you. We really do appreciate your time. And there you go. Look, it's fair to say with Tottenham, things may be moving quite slowly, but also a reality check. There's a lot of work to do this summer. Jay, thank you so much from the Daily Hotspur. We'll see you very, very soon. We appreciate it. Again, for myself, from Jay, from the brilliant, of course, Matt Law. We've been the last one on Spurs. Please keep safe, keep well. And as always, come on, you Spurs.